An interactive session today. Oh, thank you. So my name is Claire Dooley, and I will be chairing the session. This webinar is the second instalment of a three-part series hosted by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy, or ANH Academy for short. The ANH Academy is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The Academy is a global network that aims to develop an interdisciplinary community, as well as stimulate the development and harmonization of new research, as well as strengthen the capacity of the research community and facilitate the uptake of robust evidence into policies and programming. We hold many events throughout the year, with our flagship event being the annual ANH Academy Conference. This year's conference will take place between the 20th of June and the 1st of July, and will include research talks, learning labs and side events. One of our key themes for this year's conference is diets and nutrition in humanitarian contexts. So I thoroughly encourage everybody here today to consider submitting abstracts and proposals to the conference. And I should also mention that the abstract submission deadline is next week on Wednesday, the 23rd of February. Before we start, I'd like to just make a few technical announcements to ensure our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. Firstly, the webinar is being recorded and we will post the webinar on the ANH Academy website following in a few days. All participants have been muted, but please introduce yourself using the chat function. So let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization that you work with. You can access the chat box by clicking on the chat speech bubble icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. All of your videos have also been turned off just to help with bandwidth issues. We'll begin with presentations from speakers, and then later in the session, we'll open up the conversation with a Q&A. If you have any questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the whole session, and we'll do our best to raise them during the Q&A portion of today's session. When doing this, please do specify the speaker or the speakers that your question is for. During the Q&A session, we'll also invite participants wishing to ask their question aloud to raise your hand so that we can call on you to say your question aloud. Finally, if at any point you're experiencing any technical issues, please do check your audio settings as well as your internet connection. You can always try and reconnect to the session using the Zoom link that you used to join originally. If you have any technical questions, please do post them in the chat box and we'll do our very best to help you out with any issues that you're having. So today's session is the second of a three-part series on food systems approaches to food and nutrition security in humanitarian settings, and will shine a light on the existing evidence as well as the gaps in our knowledge. We have four fantastic speakers who will be providing examples from across the globe. Our speakers are Steve Wiggins from the Overseas Development Institute, Sharon Tandon from the World Bank, Olivier Sturk from the Refugees Studies Centre at the University of Oxford, and Marianella Herrera-Cuenca from the Centre for Development Studies at the Central University of Venezuela. So our first speaker, Steve Wiggins, is an agricultural economist in the Overseas Development Institute's Climate and Sustainability team. He has worked on agricultural and rural development since 1972. As a planner, as a teacher and a researcher, initially working in Latin America and subsequently focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. So I will hand over to you, Steve. So if you can share your screen and yeah, if you can share your screen and then we can kick off. Fantastic, that's great.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the chance to talk to you about some of the work that we did last year on behalf of FCDO. So this is work that was done by 8 of us at ODI and Associates, and we were asked to do a rapid evidence review on the effects of protracted conflicts and responses to it. The exam questions that we were given were two. How has protracted conflict affected livelihoods of individuals and households, local economies, national economies, and so on? And then the companion question, what responses have been seen to situations of protracted conflict to remediate and mitigate the economic and social harm caused, and how effective have those responses been? So look, what we did for this is it was largely a review by looking at existing literature supplemented by interviews with key informants, where we looked at 11 different protracted conflicts: Afghanistan, Darfur, Eastern DRC, Mali, Nepal, Northeast Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Northern Uganda, and Yemen. And the observant amongst you will realize that only 2 of those conflicts can be regarded as finalized by now: Nepal and Northern Uganda. All the other are ongoing protracted conflicts. So look, I'm not going to go into huge detail on what conflicts do. You probably realize that under conflict, there is loss of life, there is disability, there are people fleeing conflict zones, there is great destruction of property, there is great disruption to economies, there is social and psychological damage, and so on. The headline message is this. The headline message is this, is that when we talk about protracted conflicts, we really are talking about conflicts which are protracted. Few, if any, protracted conflicts end in less than 10 years. Perhaps we should say few, if any, conflicts, protracted or not, last less than 10 years. They go on. In some cases, they go on for decades. And in some cases, like Afghanistan, you're having to go back an awful long time before you can say this was an extended period of peace. Now, the scale of destruction, I'm an economist, so sometimes we like to make estimates of these things. You can't make accurate estimates, but the scale of destruction is in the billions. Doesn't matter whether it's US dollars, it doesn't matter whether it's euros, it doesn't matter whether it's pound sterling, it's in the billions. And the aid response to protracted conflict, however, is in the millions. So that's 1, 2, 3 orders of magnitude less. Now, this really matters because a lot of donors ask questions about, we spent $100 million responding to conflict in, say, South Sudan. How effective have we been? But so often what they're talking about is this response, which is 3 orders of magnitude, 1,000th less than the response which is commensurate with the destruction. There's not a lot you can do if you're dealing with a conflict which has destroyed things costing billions and you're going in with millions. So the response is always very small compared to the losses that have been sustained. So let's go on to the more important stuff, which is what do we know about responses and how effective they've been? So let's just preview the landscape. An awful lot of the responses by most agencies are done on a basis that the agency knows best, that eggheads like me know better than people on the ground what is needed. First and foremost, most agencies are providing relief. People are in trouble, there is a lot of suffering, there is a lot of misery, so relief is there first and foremost. But this tends to pitch people into a mindset which is thinking logistics. How do we get so many 1,000 tons of food to people in a refugee camp in location X? And that is not necessarily the most productive mindset to have when you're dealing with a protracted conflict. The target of most of this relief is households. How can we get to the individuals and households who we believe have been affected by the conflict? The wider economy, the impacts on the village economies, the district economies, the regional economies and national economies, that is less visible. in the responses that we see. As far as social inclusion is concerned, and I'm going to make a big point about this in a little while, the only words I could put here summarizing it is nul point. It's bloody awful, but I'll expand on why that's bloody awful later. So, okay, let's now start looking in a little bit more detail at what we found when we looked at these 11 protracted conflicts. So the first point is there tends to be a bit of a mismatch between what may be needed and what's provided. So the most common responses is you provide relief, food or cash, shelter, food, water, sanitation, health, other basic services, that gets provided by grants in kind or cash, sometimes vouchers to get the productive assets back, whatever they are, seeds, tools, you name it, livestock. Some support to village savings and loan associations, sometimes to microfinance agencies. Some vocational and business skills training is in there. Some repair and construction of roads, irrigation works, any other physical infrastructure that's in there. And that's what agencies tend to provide first and foremost. Now, is that actually what people need? So when we look at this from the point of need, we go back to the point about the insufficiency of the response compared to the damage which is confronted. The aid is very small compared to loss and need. Anytime you run a survey and you try to say how many people out of those affected actually got direct support for their livelihoods or their very existence, it's not all of them. It's not usually the majority of them, which pictures us back to what everybody in disaster relief knows. Most people survive conflict by their own efforts, The majority of aid is still in kind. Agencies know best. We provide the seeds that we chose. We provide the tools. We know what tools you need. We provide the food. We know what food you should be eating. None of this makes any sense. We really should be just letting people decide how best to use a cash transfer. Take some money. You know best what you need. Trust people. Not everything, of course, can be met by cash transfers. There are issues about freedom of movement and protecting people from physical harm. There is the business of restoring roads, physical work, all kinds of services, including schools and health points, and alleviating problems in markets, if of course we think we understand how the markets function, what's happened to them, and what might allow them to function better. A lot of what is given is livelihood support. The lessons that we get there from what we see in the 11 cases is begin livelihood support early. There's a tendency with protracted conflict to send in the relief supplies, think about relief and suffering, and then to imagine that at some point the conflict will end, and then you can go for rehabilitation, recovery, and heaven only knows what. But people have to get on with their livelihoods in the midst of conflict. So don't wait until things have become irremediably broken. Try and find some savvy way that you can give people support to their livelihoods, even in the extremely challenging and different circumstances of the conflict itself. It can be done and it can bring results. There's often more economic potential than one might imagine, particularly for moving things in conflict zones from producers to people who want things, which may be people in a regional city who want food. Sometimes it's even export markets. There is the potential to do that. Don't miss out on understanding what's going on with the supply chains, linking farmers to markets, overcoming bottlenecks, traders. Traders are often early victims of conflict. Their lorries get shot at. Their lorries get confiscated, their warehouse gets burnt down, they run out of credit, they can no longer go trading. A lot of people in aid agencies are not particularly sympathetic to traders. There is a lot of scope for working with traders to get them back on the job so that they can help the people who want to get to markets to keep something going in difficult conditions. We really should always be looking at the economy more broadly than just what's happening in the household or in the household enterprise. So there's a need to redress the attention to think about roads, markets, the services, the supply chains, the things that allow things to keep going. And of course, the point is, if you can't reach every single household affected by conflict, or even the majority of households, working on these meso level things gives you much more chance to do something useful on behalf of the majority of the people affected. I said I'd have a go at inclusion. Inclusion is typically addressed by quotas, and those quotas are usually for women and youth. Well, quotas is better than nothing, but it is women and youth. And when we were doing this particular rapid evidence review, we couldn't see much on inclusion, and somebody said, Steve, where are we on inclusion of seniors and the disabled? And I said, I can hardly find a single thing in 11 countries written about the fate of the elderly and the fate of the disabled. They're invisible. Now, this is utter and total madness. Agencies seem to struggle with conflict and inclusion. I asked myself, why are the disabled not addressed? You know, we're talking about 15 to 25% of the rural population are people living with a disability. That's bad enough in normal times. If you're under conflict and the village has to flee, what is it like if you don't have full use of your limbs? This is not rocket science. I honestly think that one of our problems on inclusion is that some social scientists, clever people like me, insist that our social science analysis has to be so sophisticated that agencies get afraid and they don't think common sense terms. What do we do for people in a wheelchair who are fleeing a village in conflict? Yeah, you don't need a PhD to start thinking through what the implications are and what may be a way to have an intervention that helps that person. I was really very shocked and rather ashamed to see how little attention in all the agency documents there was to the elderly and the disabled. Not that the analysis of women and youth was brilliant either, but that's another rant. So look, part of our story is about what people are doing, but actually the more important thing is the how. It's how you respond to conflict. Agencies need to commit sufficient funds, and they need to go in for the long term. They need to go in with enough time. If you think you're going to do it in 6 months, you're crazy. You need a five-year, more like a 10-year horizon to think about what you're doing. Process matters way more than content. Look, FCDO asks me from time to time to write a paper about best buys, as if a particular intervention was the way you do it, but it isn't like that. We all know that you can have a half-cocked intervention, brilliantly delivered, and it does some good. You can have a really good intervention, badly delivered, and it does no good. Process, not best buys. If you're dealing with process on uncertain situations, you have to go long-term, and you need flexible leadership, you need flexible systems, you need flexible procedures. Look, I'm not going to do the next slide. If anybody wants this later, all I'm saying here is that we need problem-driven iterative adaptation. We want the learning process. We do not want blueprint planning in the middle of trying to respond to conflicts. Most agencies want to do blueprint planning. It's what they were set up to do. Good field staff, of course, are always adaptive. They're always trying to work to to work with the local grain, but sometimes they're having to do it against the procedures of their agency, against what it has in the operating manual, perhaps even risking being dismissed for indiscipline. This is madness. Final slide, evidence. There is very little report on effectiveness. Most donors spend a lot of money on relief, and they tell you they delivered A, B, and C to X, Y, and Z to this million people and that. Did it have any effects? We never ask. Everybody asks for more evidence. What we need is intermediate analysis. I think there's a paralysis that goes on because people rush around saying gold standard methods, formal experiments, RCTs, and so on. You can't do RCTs in the middle of a conflict. It ain't ethical, it ain't possible, and it's far too expensive. It takes too long. It abstracts from the context, which is everything that matters. For goodness sake, I'm ashamed of us social scientists. There are options for intermediate analysis. We can do better than the way we're going. But okay, sometimes you have to work without evidence. This is my last point. So you have to work like local people work. You generate knowledge as you go and you adapt. You have flexible and adaptive management. That is the big single lesson that we got from our review of 11 cases of protracted conflict. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks so much. Excellent. Yeah, and I really wanted to kind of pick up on your point of inclusivity and thinking about different demographic groups. And I think that is definitely a common theme that we see. And yeah, thinking about different demographic groups and marginalized groups, absolutely. Okay, we're going to move swiftly on to our next speaker. But please, everyone, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box, and we will mention the speaker that your question is for. And at the end of the presentations, we will come back to all of your questions and allow the speakers a chance to respond. Fantastic. Okay, so next up is Sharon Tandon. I just want to check that Sharad, you're here.
Oh, here.
Fantastic, thanks. Great. So Sharon Tandon is a senior economist at the World Bank and has been working on poverty-related issues in Egypt, Yemen, and the broader Middle East and North African regions. Previously, Sharad worked as a research economist with the Economic Research Service of the United States Department of Agriculture, where he primarily focused on the measurement of food and nutrition security in South Asia. Fantastic. And so today, Sharad is going to be focusing on the work that he's been doing in Yemen. And so if you could make your screen, perfect, that's great. Over to you, Sharad.
Thanks so much, Claire, for the introduction. And Steve, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. You know, I couldn't agree more with a lot of the things you said. And I think Yemen is a very interesting case to look at, particularly for that first point you made, that damage is in the billions, but the assistance is in the millions. Well, this is a case where I believe the assistance is in the billions every year. And yes, damage is still in the billions as well. So you know, it's an interesting case to see and also see if that increase in funds also potentially leads to more moral quagmires, and that's something I'll actually talk about as well. But you know, so just to introduce myself, you know, I am a senior economist at the World Bank, where I've worked primarily on Yemen the last 5 years. So it should surprise no one that I'm going to be talking about the evolution of food access over the course of that conflict. And, you know, when you look at the literature and you look at, you know, kind of, you know, just taking a step back and saying, what do we expect between conflict and food security? You know, there are two big things that kind of, you know, jump out at you. The first is, you know, the onset of conflict often precipitates a food emergency. So it doesn't take a genius to look at the map and see the worst food emergencies in the world. The vast majority of them are in active conflict, and that these food emergencies started almost immediately after the conflict began. But then when you start digging under the hood a little bit and looking into each individual conflict and say, hey, are the places that are most food insecure, are they also the places that are having the most amount of violence? And that turns out not to be true. You know, I think that's an important thing to take into account when you're investigating how, you know, kind of the conflict is affecting food security and well-being more generally. So today I'm going to talk about both aspects for Yemen. I'm going to talk about what happened when the conflict was beginning, and then what happened, you know, over time as the conflict progressed to really push things towards, you know, the potentially towards the breaking point. And so Yemen's actually kind of a unique case relative to other conflict situations, not just because of the funding involved, but also the data situation. You know, Yemen is a very data deprived place, don't get me wrong, but relative to other conflicts of that severity, I think the data there is actually, you know, very voluminous compared to some of these other conflicts where we really have no idea. And it covers both periods. It covers the onset of the conflict, and it also covers the duration of the conflict. So in 2014, as Houthi forces were capturing, you know, the rest of the country, there was a household budget survey in the field going on. That was a multi-purpose survey with very detailed consumption modules, very detailed employment modules, so on and so forth, that was going to be used to reset the national poverty line, which we did, although after the conflict already started, it was well outdated. But the interesting thing about this survey is that the respondents were randomized over space and time. So you can actually see, as the conflict was starting, how did households respond in real time? So that's one of the information gaps that we have that we hope that Yemen can help inform other places. And then the other survey that's been ongoing that I'm going to talk about was done by the WFP, and it's a wonderful survey. It's very unique in a conflict setting, where they've been doing a monthly mobile phone survey every single month almost since August 2015. It is a true goldmine of information. They spent a lot of money on it, and I think it's truly amazing that they were able to create this kind of survey in this environment. So yes, it's biased, but what we can do is look at over time to see amongst this biased sample, as all these conflict-related shocks are happening, sometimes for the entire country, sometimes for particular regions, how does food access respond in real time? So that's another thing we can do. And I should say at the outset, much of this work actually is partnered with WFP, and the wonderful work that they do. So, you know, at the onset of the conflict, you know, what happened? And as you can imagine, you know, it should surprise no one that as soon as the conflict started, there was a large and immediate decline in increase in poor food access. So, but you know, WFP did a big survey immediately before, and a year and a half into the conflict, you see by a year and a half in, you know, the people qualifying for emergency food assistance actually increased to the vast majority of the population. So it increased by 20%, and this is a pretty high bar to reach. So the population is actually quite suffering very early on in the conflict. But going back to that household survey, let's decompose this a little bit in real time. So one of the events that happened in 2014 was the Houthi forces captured Sana'a in the third quarter of 2014. And what we can do is we can actually compare how households, you know, acted in the fourth quarter to immediately prior in the third quarter to understand, you know, how things changed in real time. And Steve, for precisely the things you were saying, there was a huge increase in underemployment, and there was an increase in food prices, particularly for fuel and perishable items. And so at this time, you know, that people were struggling to earn an income, they were also forced to pay more for vital goods. It obviously led to almost immediate, you know, kind of poor repercussions. In the first few months, some households were able to cope well, and their consumption was maintained. But by December, by the third month of the capture, all households had a huge decline, both in expenditure and also calorie consumption, which only happens in really extreme circumstances. So, and we're talking about declines of roughly 30% within 3 months. So it's really shocking how quickly this happened. So that's the onset of the conflict, and there's some other details there. If people are interested, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'm happy to provide you with more information. But then now, like I said before, we can go over the entire course of the conflict since 2015 and see when are these spikes in poor food access and how do they relate to the shocks that are happening. And the long and the short of it is that both the number and types of shocks that happen are what push at any one time is what's pushing the country closer to catastrophic outcomes. The first question you might have is, how is violence related to this? Is this one of the shocks we care about? And the surprising answer is, obviously it's a shock we care about, but how is it related to food security? So you can look at that time series of food access. You see the violence is increasing over time, and it doesn't seem to have much relationship with when there are spikes in poor food access. Similarly, when you look at a map of where food access is worse, and you compare it to a map where violence is worse, well, you see violence is very concentrated, but poor food access is very dispersed, and even in places with little to no violence. So that really begs the question, what's going on? Like, why isn't this the case? And one of the reasons why you're finding the geographic location of violence is not as tied to food security as you'd hope is because some of these instances of violence are more important than others, and they have impacts far beyond the locations where they occur. And so this is a case of one particular case of violence, which is the complete air and sea blockade in November 2017. You see overnight fuel prices increased by 30%, which caused a worsening of food security for the entire population across the entire country. Granted, it was more centered on those who are slightly better off, who are consuming more fuel, but it still had repercussions over the entire country. So that's one of the reasons why the actual precise location of violence is a little less important to the food security situation than one might expect. Now, the other thing to mention that not all shocks are created equal. So you look at these shocks that affect food access, and we're going to compare every single one to see which has the largest spike in the share with poor food access. And it turns out it's the instances where there are really rapidly rising food prices, which are most commonly associated with currency crises in Yemen. So one happened in 2018 across the entire country, another one happened in 2020 and in the south of the country. And what happened was, the price of all goods were increasing at the same time. But one thing that we can do is we can decompose it and compare it to other shocks where only fuel prices increased. And so that particularly when you look at the blockade, which only caused fuel prices to increase and not food prices, you saw a much more muted impact on the share who had poor food access. It's really the food prices that are really driving the action at the bottom of the welfare distribution in these settings. Additionally, something else that was really surprising to me is how quickly, in the one instance when food prices were normalized, how quickly households responded and food consumption was reverted back to what it was before the shock. So again, it's not just the shocks that are happening; it's also the type of shocks that are happening that are pushing the country closest to catastrophic outcomes. Now, this one is more of a hypothetical slide and something that I'd be kind of irresponsible not to share with you. And it's something we are working on. And it's important to note that data is becoming much more difficult to collect in this conflict. And particularly in the north of the country where 2/3 of the population live. So all surveys need approval from the authorities. There's numerous examples where the authorities are interfering with sampling. They'll require their people to go along with enumerators, or they'll limit where people are able to go to do their interviews. They also interfere with questionnaires and limit the types of things we can get, and they restrict who has access to microdata, if anybody, outside the country. And so increasingly we're being asked by the authorities in the country to trust them that we're getting a nationally representative estimate. But I'm not going to say anything about kind of their motives, but I'm just going to talk about other settings where incentives matter. And you think about when you have large food assistance programs or large social protection programs in other settings, what has happened? People learn the rules, they learn the PMT, they learn what they need to do, and they start gaming the system. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, because everybody needs money in some of these circumstances. So I'm not saying that they're morally bad for doing so. I'm just saying it's human nature for that kind of possibility to evolve. And so you think about the authorities in the country, and they have incentives too when it comes to humanitarian assistance. They see, if they were able to portray their population as more food insecure than they were, more assistance might come to them. Or if along the front lines where they need fighters, if there's less food assistance going there, maybe they have a higher pool of fighters they can recruit. I'm not saying these are things that are happening. I'm just saying their incentives might not be aligned with the humanitarian response. And you actually see this in the difficulty of collecting data. In 2016, with the first emergency food security assessment, you saw, a lot of people had pretty good access to the country. But then the authorities saw, kind of how pivotal this one survey was to figuring out the total amount of assistance that came and where it went. And so the second time they tried to run the same exact survey, things weren't quite so easy. I don't know why, but this is one possibility. And so it's an important thing to note. There are people who are questioning kind of how poor off the population is, and in particular, there was a humanitarian worker who has since left their job and wrote a report with the Sana Center saying, hey, the humanitarian agencies are overstating how dire the things are, and there's more resilience in the population than they're admitting. And so I think it comes back to this data issue that we just don't have a good idea of what's going on, and that's important to know. So really quickly, I'll wrap up. I think I'm taking too long, so sorry about that. So what does this mean for other conflicts, kind of in general? And so and it's important not just to make this Yemen specific. And I think the first thing to note is that, Steve, like you were saying, livelihoods are really important. And kind of the theory of change is, okay, we do emergency assistance, we do livelihood assistance, and try to break this cycle of dependence on humanitarian assistance. And these results about, okay, it's not just the violent areas that are food insecure, suggest that that's something we possibly could do during conflict. We could go to nonviolent areas that are just as poor off and try to promote livelihoods. As difficult as it is, because we have difficulty spurring the private sector, but with all this demand coming from, aggregate demand coming from the humanitarian response, with $4.5 billion a year going into the country, that can spur private sector, kind of activity. But the sad thing from Yemen is, even with that, even if that happens, the price increases and the currency crises are issues related to the conflict, and they can overwhelm any humanitarian and livelihood assistance you do. So unfortunately, this is kind of a negative finding, in the sense that no matter it's really pivotal to end these conflicts. Obviously, that goes without saying, but it can be very, very difficult to try to support the population through this kind of event. The second thing I wanted to mention is also obvious. There's a lot of uncertainty. Even if there's a lot of data collection going on, you should be wary of someone saying, "Oh, we've done data collection. Trust us." There's always caveats, especially in these kinds of circumstances. And the last thing I want to say is that this situation can lead to moral dilemmas. Now, again, I'm talking in abstract. I'm not talking about Yemen, but you think about it, about the humanitarian development response. We can go to donors and we can say, hey, we can support these people through this crisis, and we won't do it up to our normal standards. And so it'll cost more, it'll be a little bit messier, but we can do it, or we cannot go in at all because we can't do it perfectly. What would you prefer? And donors are always going to choose, okay, we can't let people die, we have to go in. And that's the right choice in probably most circumstances. But over time, as the emergency goes into its 7th year, as some of this, as things change and more difficulties prop on top of each other, these kinds of responses can have inertia too. And it's important to take a step back and reevaluate that question and ask, what is a bridge too far? What should we put up with? I think that's not a question that we have an answer to, but it's a question that always needs to be asked. Thank you. So sorry for taking so long.
Thank you so much. No, I think you were good on the timing. It was great. Thanks so much. Super, super interesting. Yeah, really, really, really interesting stuff. I have some questions, but I will save my questions till the end. So please, everybody, if you have any questions, please do put them into the chat box, and we will address them after all the presentations have been. So our next speaker is Olivier Sturk, who is a lead economist of the Refugees Economies Programme at the University of Oxford. His research is multidisciplinary in scope, building bridges between development economics, health economics, and refugee studies. Olivier has worked with the World Food Programme as well as the World Bank on various impact evaluations of cash-based assistance programmes. So over to you, Olivier.
Myself. Okay, thanks a lot. So today I will present the research program that I have on food assistance to refugees living in camps, with a focus on refugees living in Kenya. And it's a series of projects that we have done with WFP Kenya. And so for years, you may know that the main model of refugee assistance in camps was a humanitarian model, and it relates to the first talks, a humanitarian model of care and maintenance. It's a model that assumes that refugee crises are temporary, implying that the main role of humanitarian organizations is basically limited to protecting and feeding refugees until they can return to their origin countries. And one key element of this model is, of course, the provision of monthly in-kind food rations to refugees to give them basically enough calories to survive through the temporary crisis. And most actors working with refugees on the ground now recognize that this humanitarian approach is deceptive. Why? Simply because crises are not temporary, and care and maintenance is expensive and sustainable and profoundly unsatisfactory for refugees. And so the promotion of self-reliance is now becoming the new, let's say, theoretical paradigm in refugee assistance. The objective is becoming to develop refugee economies, and how to do that through investment in education, in income generating activities, and through the promotion of cash transfers. That's in theory, because for the moment, there are still very few places where they try to really implement this model. And so the research that I'll present today actually aim at to assess, to study one experiment actually where this approach was piloted, and to assess therefore whether their self-reliance approach to refugee assistance is having an impact on refugees and on local economies. And so the policy experiment I'll focus on is currently taking place in northern Kenya. Some of you may know that Kenya has adopted a quite strict encampment policy, so it requires refugees to reside in camps, and it also restricts refugees' freedom of movement and right to work. And so as a result, the bulk of refugees who arrived in Kenya actually before 2016, they had to settle in 2 massive refugee camps that were created in the 90s. And one of these camps is located in northern West Kenya, and it's called Kakuma. So it's close to the Ugandan and the South Sudanese border. And at the time of my first field work there in 2016, 2017, the Kakuma camp was a symbol of the humanitarian approach to refugee assistance. So this camp was accommodating about 150,000 refugees, most of them from South Sudan and Somalia. And the average household there in Kakumaso had spent on average 7 years in the camp. Most refugees were surviving on monthly food rations, and very few were working. In our first data set that we collected there, only 24% of adults were working for an income, and typically they were actually working for humanitarian organizations. And so in May 2016, actually, a refugee site called Kadobi was opened 3.5 kilometers away from the old Kakuma camp. So it hosts nearly 40,000 refugees, most of them from South Sudan. And actually it was created because the humanitarian community and the Kenyan government recognized that the approach that was used in Kakuma was unsatisfactory, that it was failing. And so the Kadobi settlement shares many of the challenges that limit the economic opportunities in Kakuma, but the Kadobi settlement has adopted an approach that is completely different from Kakuma. It has a different objective. It aims to foster the self-reliance of refugees and of host communities, basically by trying to foster livelihood, and one activity that they do is to promote cash transfers. And in fact, like related to these objectives, 2 programs were particularly visible when we did our first survey there. First, in-kind food rations had been entirely or almost entirely replaced by a system of mobile money transfers. And then second, small-scale agriculture was much more widely promoted in Kadobi compared to Kakuma. And so it's in this context that I've done 3 impact evaluations between 2016 and 2019. First, to assess the impact of the self-reliance approach in Kadobi. Second, to assess the impact of food assistance delivered as cash instead of in-kind transfers on local businesses and markets. And then third, to compare two different modalities of cash transfer that were piloted in Kadobe. So it's cash transfer for food assistance. And so in what follows, I'd like to briefly explain the results of these three impact evaluations that were done with the World Food Programme. So first question, we wanted to assess the impact of self-reliance programming in Kadobe. And to do that, what we did is to use what we call a regression discontinuity design. So we exploited the fact that there was a sharp cutoff date in the location of refugees between Kakuma and Kadobe, basically when Kadobe opened. So before the 14th of May 2016, all refugees who arrived in Kenya and were registering in Kakuma had to go to the Kakuma camp. And then after that date, virtually all newly registered refugees had to go to Kadobe. And so the idea of the regression discontinuity design is to compare the refugees on each side of this cutoff date and to consider a window of time that is sufficiently narrow so that refugees who arrived within that window of time were very similar before their arrival in Kenya. And so the fact that some refugees arrived in Kenya just before or just after the cutoff date can be considered as quasi-random. And so within like this narrow window that I've shown on the screen in green. And so we assess the impact of living in Kadobe versus Kakuma by comparing basically the outcomes of refugees on each side of this cutoff date. And when we compare, so the refugees on both sides of the cutoff, what we find is quite interesting. We find that refugees in Kadobe have higher dietary diversity, and the value of their consumption is also significantly higher. We also find that they eat more calories per person, and they are less likely to be food insecure. By contrast, we find no effect on non-food spending and no effect on an asset index. But we find some evidence that the refugees in Kadobe report higher level of subjective well-being and higher degree of independence from aid. And so overall, the self-reliant approach in Kadobe seems to have a positive impact, especially on nutrition and on perceptions. And so we explored in our research different channels to explain what we call this Kadobe effect, this effect of self-reliance programming. And one channel that seems particularly relevant is the involvement in agriculture. So households in Kadobe at the time of our research were 40 percentage points more likely to have a kitchen garden and be involved in agriculture. And this factor seems to mediate, so to explain, to be a channel of the effect that we find on dietary diversity and on food security. And then another channel that seems to matter, of course, it relates to food assistance. Food assistance is supposed to be equal value in both Kakuma and Kadobe. But at the time of our survey, so in 2016, refugees living in Kadobe were receiving all food assistance through a cash transfer program, which is called Bamba Chakula, which means get your food in Swahili. And so every month, refugees in Kadobe, they were receiving $14 per person on a SIM card, and they could use this SIM card to buy food, actually only food, in certain shops. So that's quite important, actually. So the Bamba Chakula program, and I'll study further this program later on. So this Bamba Chakula program of cash transfer is restricted in two ways. First, the digital currency can only be spent on food items and only at some specific shops that were licensed by WFP. So that's for Kadobe, cash transfer with this digital cash transfer with this digital currency. And in Kakuma, it was quite different. Refugees were receiving more than 70% of their food ration in kind, and a very small proportion through Bamba Chakula. And so different observation actually that we made in our paper suggests that a substantial part of this Kadobe effect is due to the greater importance of the cash transfers in Kadobe. And let me turn to the second paper that I'd like to discuss today. And it's a paper that assesses the impact of the Bamba Chakula program on cash transfers, on businesses and markets. And so as I've just said, the program has two types of restrictions. First, the money can only be used to purchase food. And second, the digital money can only be spent at 250 shops that have a Bamba Chakula license that was provided by WFP. And so in our second research that we did there, we explored quasi-random variation in the licensing process to assess the impact of Bamba Chakula licenses, which give access to the cash transfer market, basically. And so businesses, they had to apply to get a Bamba Chakula license, and then to be able to accept the payment in the digital currency. So it was an open application process. It was open to anyone, and 533 people applied to get a license. And then there was a selection committee, a multi-stakeholder committee, that used basically data, a spreadsheet with data on each applicant to determine who would get a license. And the goal of this committee was to include a mixed group of business owners in terms of gender, nationalities, location of their shops, and the type of product that they were selling. And there were not really any hard criteria. And in the end, 252 licenses were allocated. And so in our empirical work, what we do is to compare licensed shops with similar shops that also applied to get a license, but were unsuccessful. And we use matching methods to do that, to control for selection bias. And as explained in our paper, we believe that our setting is very good for matching methods, because basically we have access to the exact same data set that the selection committee used to select which business would get a license. And so we can fully control for this selection process. So what are our main results? First, we show that successful applicants were 24 percentage points more likely to still have a retail business at the time of the survey. So having a license increases both the probability of business survival and business creation. Second, licensed businesses have much higher revenue and profits. And third, we find no effect on cash sales. What does it mean? Basically, it means that Bamba Chakula shops, so those that have a license, they are not more competitive on the cash market. Actually, all the increased sales and profits come from the Bamba Chakula sales, so only from the sales that they can do in exchange from the cash transfers. And we also find that licensed shops have more employees, higher productivity, they sell a larger variety of products, and their household, actually, they also have better diets, more assets, and higher level of income. And another finding is that actually the prices in this Bamba Chakula market, they are much higher than in the hard cash market. So what we find is that actually the businesses that have this Bamba Chakula license, they charge higher prices for purchases that are made with the Bamba Chakula money. And this evidence is actually consistent with a lower degree of competition in the Bamba Chakula market. And this can be explained by the fact that licensed shops are comparatively fewer. There are large transportation costs within the camp and the Kakuma camp and the Kalabi settlement, and that increased the market power of licensed shops. So what Dooley learned from this study? First, that shops that can accept cash transfer payment massively benefit from the cash transfer program. So there are spillovers on the local economies. But because of market imperfections, actually they can also charge higher prices because they have higher market powers. And this comes at the expense of the cash transfer recipients. So the Bamba Chakula traders, they can capture part of the benefits of the cash transfer program, and basically at the expense of the transfer recipients. And then finally, quickly, we did a third research impact evaluation, and the idea was to compare the impact of the Bamba Chakula system to another system of cash transfer, which is unrestricted, in the sense that the money can be spent on any items and in any shop. So in short, in this other system, refugees received MasterCards and received their monthly assistance, their food assistance transfer on this card. And we compared this system of unrestricted cash transfer to the Bamba Chakula program, which, remember, is restricted in two ways. So the digital currency can only be spent on food items and only at licensed shops. And basically, theory predicts that unrestricted cash transfers are better than cash transfers that are restricted, especially if the resale of unrestricted goods is costly and if the cash transfers are large. But this theory has never really been tested empirically in a context where restriction actually matter, and that's what we do. And we do it in Karabai. Basically, WFP piloted this system of unrestricted cash transfer with 1,000 households living in one well-defined part of the settlement. And what we do is to compare households that are receiving unrestricted cash transfer with similar households that were receiving transfer using this Bamba Chakula system. So it's the two areas that are defined on this map. And we show that the system, the two groups of household, let's say the treatment and control household, are very similar in terms of a series of predetermined characteristics. And so that this constitutes a natural experiment. And in short, what do we find? We find that restrictions matters. They make household worse off. So in short, deciding that households should spend their cash transfer on food is a bad idea. Why? Because households who receive the cash transfer that are restricted to food, they need to buy other stuff as well as food, and they know what they need to do. And the only way to do so is basically to purchase food, then resell the food and use the money to buy non-food items. And households lose a lot of money and time in that process. We find that during the month preceding our survey, about 69% of the households that were receiving restricted cash transfer resold food to obtain cash and be able to purchase other type of goods. And we also find that median prices in the resale market are something like 18 to 38% lower than retail market prices, implying that households reselling goods in the resale market, basically they incur large losses. And so households on unrestricted cash transfer then are less likely to engage in this costly practice because they receive unrestricted cash transfer, and so they don't need to resell the goods that they're purchasing. And so as a result, households receiving unrestricted cash transfer, they have higher non-food expenditure, and they report also higher subjective well-being. But we find no evidence of a reduction in food consumption, and that's very important. It shows that the positive effect that we find on non-food expenditure does not come basically at the expense of a reduction in food consumption. So let me briefly conclude. So our research agenda on food assistance in refugee camps in Kenya shows that the self-reliance approach seems to have positive impacts, in particular through agricultural promotion and through cash transfers. And the cash transfers, actually, they also benefit local businesses that can accept the digital currency. There are, however, two important limitations or caveats that I would like to emphasize. First, market imperfections increase the market power of businesses. And so because of this increased market power, basically businesses can capture part of the benefits of the cash transfers at the expense of transfer recipients. So organizations implementing cash transfer should consider the market structure before implementing cash transfer programs and possibly implement complementary interventions to try to increase or stimulate competition. And then second, restrictions on consumer choices appear to negatively impact cash transfer recipients. So organizations willing to restrict consumer choices should therefore carefully examine the question and justify their choice, because typically unrestricted cash transfer seems to be better. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff and really, really important research and quite fascinating results, really. Okay, we're going to finally just move on to our fourth speaker. So if anybody has questions, please do put them in the chat and we will address them to the speakers after this final presentation. So we'll move over to Marianella. So Marianella is an associate professor at the Central University of Venezuela. She is CEO of the Venezuelan Health Observatory and board director of the Bengoa Foundation for Food and Nutrition. She is also on the chair. She is also the chair of the Global Food Security Task Force of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and is also a member of the National Cluster Nutrition UNICEF for Venezuelan Complex Humanitarian Emergencies. So I will hand over to you, Marianella. If you can start sharing your screen, that'd be great.
Thank you very much for inviting me to share our experience in our different and unique country. Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, that's perfect, thanks.
Okay. Well, as you may have heard, Venezuela once back 20 years, 25 years ago, was a country that was not perfect, definitely, but was in a road to get every day a little bit a better development. However, we have been categorized as a complex humanitarian emergency since our situation is neither an armed conflict nor a natural disaster. So it's a very unique case. It was a crisis of slow installation at the very beginning, and it was very, very difficult to prove due to the delay in official sources of information. So here is a thing that I will be bringing up to the table over and over through my presentation, because it was such a hard time to prove what was going on, because it basically international multilateral agencies from the United Nations system, they use official government data. And even though we did have at some point alternative data, it was not used at all to report the situation in the country. So now we have ENCOVI, which is the National Standard Survey Conditions for Venezuelans. Now we have the Venezuelan Food Security and Nutrition Observatory data that made an excellent work compiling information during the end of 2020 and the first trimester of 2021. And definitely official data goes behind. Particularly should be mentioned that mortality rate reports are not due since 2014. And a short report at the end of 2016 went out, and we cannot even explain why that happened. But since projected information has been the basis of information and no longer is applicable to the situation, and you can see reports from FAO or UNICEF saying, for example, that in 2016, children under 500 undernourished were based on a projection data from 2009. So it was crazy. How can you project and organize humanitarian aid and people are starving, and you cannot show it properly because there is the right data to show it. So the challenges for researchers and academia have been enormous. As I said, we now have several alternative sources of data, such as ENCOVI. I mentioned that before. Lately, at the very beginning, ENCOVI was the joint group of 3 main universities, including myself and my university. Then lately, it became just the Catholic University. And then we have the observatory, the Food Security Observatory. Then we have Caritas Venezuela, surveillance on acute malnutrition for children under 5, and the Bengoa Foundation, surveillance on school-age children and maternal child nutrition on the first 1,000 days. So we do have some data. It's not perfect, but we do have it. So here is our question. How can we align all this to promote a better intervention in Venezuela? We all know that it's so inconsistent that we have the largest oil reserves in the world, and we can potentially be a very rich country, and the health system is completely devastated. No protocols of vaccination, not only COVID vaccination, but whatever vaccination we need, it's completely impaired. And also, the economy experiences one of the highest hyperinflations in the world, which affects, of course, the acquisition power of the households, and therefore it translates in a very important food insecurity situation for the majority of the population. So here is one thing. In 2019, 2020, we have the opportunity to be consultants for the World Food Program while doing this, survey, national survey in Venezuela. And therefore, after they had this evaluation done by themselves, they could use the data, and then Venezuela got reported in the map of acute food insecurity hotspots of the world. It was the 4th place, just after Afghanistan, Yemen, South Sudan, and then Venezuela. But it was because the World Food Program themselves conducted and performed with local, joining our local team, of course, we were able to gather that data. And it was the WFP data that could introduce Venezuela on the list. And if you see, the migratory crisis continues, and Colombia is being the principal country receiving Venezuelan migrants, up to 1,800,000 Venezuelans displaced to Colombia. So that is a huge problem. That is a regional problem. You cannot tell that is such a movement, migratory movement is ongoing in a region. Is there any problem that you should be taking care of? So if we see now the 2022 map of hunger spots, Venezuela disappeared, and people got very angry in the previous weeks in Venezuela, because of course we wanted to see the Venezuelan situation reflected on this. However, because there is no official data, nor a new survey implemented by WFP themselves, there is no Venezuela included in the list of hunger spots this year. We can see, if we go through the report, when we arrive to the narrative countries of the countries, we get to Colombia. And Colombia, when you read this narrative, there is no way to put aside the Venezuelan problem. However, this could affect the way funds and resources get into Venezuela for humanitarian aid. So we need to better align the criteria between what is required to establish a humanitarian assistance extremely needed in some cases, and this inconsistent way to address some of the issues regarding that humanitarian assistance. If we see the late report on the Venezuelan Food Security and Nutrition Observatory, we can see here that food insecurity, moderate and severe, these two things here, figures here, down here, it's 46.4% of the Venezuelans that were surveilled with this work that are having extremely bad situation, and they have trouble because the thing is most altered and impaired for them is the means of life. When you have this means of life completely impaired and people doing into risky jobs, and they have to sell their assets just for buying food, then you understand that even though the food consumption they reflect in your food frequency questionnaire, because people can say, I eat beef every day, but I do have to lend money to buy my foods. I have to skip a meal. I do not eat one of the meal because I give them to my children. Then you understand that food consumption is impacted by these surveillance strategies and the means of life that are completely impaired. And that is almost half of the Venezuelan population, which is now much, it is smaller because we have more than 5 million migrants all over the world. So what have we learned? It was very, very difficult to understand and to make understand the world that we were really going into a bad situation. This has been ongoing at least from 15 years ago, and only is being recognized as such just 5 years ago. In the meantime, a lot of children died. A lot of pregnant women, I cannot tell the maternal mortality rate that we do have now, of course, with other parallel ciphers and data, because the official data doesn't exist. But also the older adults, and I take the words from Steve that say that in a humanitarian context, not only pregnant women, lactating women, and children under 5 are at risk. Older adults, you know, our tragedy is that professors at the university earn such a low salary that they cannot afford the basic baskets of food. And now I am in a commission at the Institute of Professor Prevention of Health that we are doing assistance program for the elderly retired professors, because it's so painful that you see, you know, people that were, you know, brilliant people, and now they are starving. That should not be, and that is not taken into account into the assistance methodology, nor even a program, etc. The other thing is men are being neglected. And we all know that spermatogenesis is a very sensitive biological process. And we now have evidence of what is happening when a man is exposed to hunger for the future generation. So we have a very complex problem here with people all being exposed to hunger, pregnant women, men, adolescents, school-age children, children under 5, right? And of course, older adults. So it's a massive problem. I really think that what we have learned is everything needs to be documented first. It took a long time to get documented this crisis in a proper way. Even if the alternative data is not taken into account for developing assistance or humanitarian programs, documenting and publishing is a priority. Our research team suggests that a review in the criteria of the data that can be used, taking into account the UN mandate that protection of vulnerable population and civilians in general is a priority. And all the officials from the agencies on the field should take the voice of telling what is going on the field. That is a mandate, if I remember well, from the then Secretary of the UN, Ban Ki-moon at the moment. If I remember well, also, it was from a conflict in Myanmar that went to this mandate, the origin of this mandate in that case. Finally, I wanted to say that what is ongoing in Venezuela, because it has been slowly, and now it's a protracted crisis also, it's an anthropologic and sociological damage, because when you have just 3 foods to eat or 2 foods to eat, your diet becomes monotonous. Many people in Venezuela, in low-income setting, used to be, you know, food entrepreneurs, and they have their own little food stores and food selling and typical preparation. But you cannot do that, and you don't see that anymore. So culture is being impaired. Culture is being affected, and particularly the culinary nutrition aspect of culture is being impaired. And culturally speaking, and the culinary traditions give you identity as a nation. What people that is Venezuelan migrants are taking in their souls to everywhere in the world? Arepas. Arepas is the main thing they want to share with the world. And that is disappearing within Venezuela. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And we can talk about many more things later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianella. We're going to, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to questions. We have just about 15 minutes left. So fantastic. We have a few questions from participants, so I'm just going to read them out and address them to each of the speakers that they are for. And then but just as I'm going through the questions, please, anybody who would like to ask a question aloud, just please raise your hand using the reactions function at the bottom of the screen. So first we have a question from for Steve from Cecilia Gonzalez. She says, it's really good to hear these things being said in this presentation. I feel many of what everything that you're saying, everything that you're sharing, some of us know and have thought about a lot. So the question is, how do we make the change?
You want an answer to that one? It's an excellent question. How do you make the change? Some of this, you know, when we talk about adaptive management, for example, and there's a question there from Sunitha which says, do you have examples of adaptive management? Well, one of the things you want to do with adaptive management is you're not backing a particular intervention, you're backing processes, you're backing people. And when you talk about backing people, that sounds horribly subjective and it sounds amateurish. Let me tell you which people in the world back people and don't back things. Venture capitalists in California. Yep. First question you ask as a venture capitalist in California is, what is the caliber of the people applying for my venture capital funds? They will encounter difficulties, they will encounter problems. Can they actually solve those problems? Do they have the determination? Do they have the capacity to do that? That's the number one question for a venture capitalist, yeah? And it's a question about character, experience, about the qualifications of the people, their aptitudes, their skills, their vocation, yeah? If venture capitalists dealing in millions and millions of dollars, and they don't want to lose their dollars, they want to make a lot of money, and often they do. If they are using what sounds to a bureaucracy like a very subjective judgment about the capacity of the people they invest in, we should be doing the same if you're in a relief agency. Just because you've got auditors somewhere in the background, just because somebody said that in a professional organization, you can't make subjective judgments about people. No, you have to say, okay, let's define what the characteristics of success will be, and then let's find a way of assessing those characteristics. So that's the direction I would want agencies to go down. Now, you know, field staff know this. They know they need to adapt and so on. So to some extent, my argument is that of a straw man. But you also know in many agencies, the good field staff, they're having to do this against the procedures of their organizations, in spite of the operating manual. It should be the other way around. The organization should be supporting them to make the changes which are necessary. This can happen, it happens with venture capitalism. It should happen with some of the more bureaucratic, and most aid agencies are naturally bureaucratic. They should be able to make those changes. Messy answer, sorry.
No, great, thanks, Steve, thanks. So the next question is for Sharad. So this is a question from Annabelle Summers. I would be interested to hear more about the metrics involved in assessing food prices and food insecurity. Sharad, I think you had food consumption scores in your presentation, I think.
Yeah, really quickly, I think Marianella has her hand up, so she might wanted to say something on the previous.
I'm so sorry. Go ahead, Marianella.
Yes, I just wanted to support what Steve was saying, because that's why we want to propose really in a serious way to make a revision of the criteria. And how can we really make change if there are issues that are not being considered for making those changes, and everything is so bureaucratic that it can take years. In the time when you fill up this bureaucratic process, people are just died or worsen the situation, and then you have double or triple times the problem, the initial problem. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so the question for Sharad is, which types of foods are included in the price surveys, and whether other household goods are also included? So I think this is relating to the food prices that you were talking about.
Sure. So the food price data is coming from WFP, who is doing monthly market surveys every single month in the capital of each governorate. So they were doing this before the conflict, and then they continued to do it after. And they actually vastly expanded the list of food items they got. So there might have been like 7, 8 food items, kind of standard staples, plus a couple of other things, some fresh foods, etc., prior to the conflict. But then after the conflict, it's like 45 things. They try to capture things that are just too difficult to capture. So, but kudos to them for trying hard. But that said, you can create, to the degree that you're able to, like a food price basket. That's what most people do in trying to estimate inflation. But you can also play with individual things. Like I said, it's like 30, 40 different food items, including a few different types of fuel, and also importantly, including market exchange rates, which are really important in Yemen. Over.
Great, thanks. And so the next question is for Olivier. Did you examine different measures of nutrition security and nutrition outcomes over time? So at the individual level, as well as the household level, across the 3 groups. So your recipients, your restricted cash, and your unrestricted cash.
Yes, the answer is yes and no. So I've not shown any data over time in this presentation. Then we have actually collected panel data in Kenya, where we can measure basically how food security evolves over time and other outcomes evolve over time. One big challenge with this data that I should recognize is, of course, the challenge of attrition. Refugees are mobile population. They tend to move within the camps, but also to the cities or even abroad in response to shocks, but in response to different circumstances, etc. And so when we, for example, like we collected actually different panel data set, but the first panel data set that we collected in Kakuma and Kalobei, if I remember well, attrition of households from one year to another was 25%, which is quite high. And so that means that we actually studied, and you can find on the website of the Refugee Economics Program, how food security evolved from one year or another. But in a way, we don't know whether that treated household, the one that who left because they were in a war situation and the evolution was significantly worse or significantly better, and that's why they left. And so in a way, we are left with somehow imperfect panel. We can draw some conclusion about those who stayed at the same place or in the same camps, let's say, but it's difficult to draw, let's say, to be fully representative, in the sense that we are of course missing those that have moved and that cannot be traced. And this kind of high attrition rate, we found them in other contexts. We also found them actually when trying to collect panel data set in Nairobi, and also later on in Kakuma. So unfortunately, that's always a challenge when studying following refugees over time.
Yeah, I was also wondering, just very briefly, you talked about the accounting for in the analysis, accounting for the shops that were rejected and accepted, and so the fundamental differences. Could you just very briefly kind of talk about what that criteria was for accepting and rejecting those licenses?
Yes. So there were no hard criteria. Basically, they had, like, the committee received an Excel sheet, and we have that Excel sheet, and basically on that Excel sheet you could see whether the shop was the shop of the applicant was a small or a large shop, whether it has a weighting scale, whether it had a business license, whether it was a male or female, the nationality, the location within the camp or the settlement, different criteria like that. There were, I don't know, 20 or 30 variables. And what is sure is that this committee wanted to have licensed shop a bit everywhere. And it wanted also to promote, to give more licenses to women, to promote basically gender empowerment. But apart from that, there were no hard criteria. And so they tried to pick a mix of shops a bit everywhere, different genders, different nationalities, to, in a way, please all communities, promote gender empowerment, and also be relatively efficient from a geographical point of view, have shops, licensed shops a bit everywhere to minimize transportation costs. And when we actually use regression analysis to check which factor matters the most, it's in the gender, the location of the shop, and the nationality. These are the three factors that matter, and the rest doesn't matter much. Also, selling vegetables actually matters. And that was one objective of the WFP, to promote better nutrition. And so they wanted shops that already have contact with producers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, great, thank you. And Marianella, I just wanted to very, very quickly, I know you talked a lot about the lessons learned, and it's incredibly interesting, but I just wonder if you could very, very quickly, or not quickly, briefly suggest that the next steps, like what is the next most important thing in terms of nutrition in Venezuela?
I would think, and I was just putting something in the chat, that I wanted to propose a later discussion on how prevention is key. Early actions are definitely a key and strategical point that often is not taken into account. And that is why I'm just concerned on how to shorten this bureaucratic process to lead the path and allow to the real actions that we need. Because the other thing is that when you engage in this process of humanitarian assistance for such a long time, people get engaged with the humanitarian assistance. Then to put aside people away from a program, it's such a difficult thing. Independency should be preserved always, at all times. So that's why I think prevention is key. Early prevention should be our next step.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so my colleague is just about to post a survey into the chat box, so please do, participants, please do fill out the survey if you have a moment. So we have one final question. So this question is for both Sharad and Olivier. So how do we make data systems on livelihoods and food systems more robust in these difficult contexts? And that's a question from Sunita.
I don't know if I can start and then Sharad can complement. I mean, data systems, I have two ideas that come to my mind, and it relates to two different objectives of collecting data. First, there is an objective of collecting descriptive data to understand problems. And there, I think it's mainly basically large organizations like WFP, UNHCR that need to invest, and they already do that. WFP is already doing that on a large scale, collect data regularly to try to track and identify problems and monitor problems and identify trends. And then the second objective of collecting data is assessing the impact of programs. And there, the efforts are much more like patchy, let's say. Some missions and some organizations start doing impact evaluation, and that's very important, while others don't do that. And so there is no systematic effort. And there, I think that international organization would gain from thinking outside the box and partnering with academics who like to think about impact evaluation and that it's possible and that it can be done, and try to find creative way, not to do randomized control trial, because in humanitarian settings, it's often difficult and unethical, but try to find other ways, quasi-experimental methods, to still try to assess the impact of some of the programs that they do, if it's possible, and if it's not too expensive compared to the cost of the program, and if the answer that they could get from the impact evaluation can meaningfully guide the choice that they have to make between one program or another. And there, I think more partnerships and thinking outside of the box is important. And
yeah, no, I agree with Olivier on a lot of those points, particularly with partnerships and sharing data that's collected. You know, the data sharing, I think, is key to make sure we don't duplicate efforts, and to make sure that we get as much as we can from these really expensive endeavors. So I think that's important. You know, so I think there's potentially two worlds here. So like I work in the world of Yemen, which is particularly difficult when it comes to data collection. And then there are other worlds in which, like, let's say the internationally recognized government is in control of the country and the majority of the population. So I think that the latter case is more straightforward, but, you know, in the former case, you know, you really have to be able to throw the kitchen sink at it and triangulate between different types of data. And so, you know, we're trying to put together data systems in Yemen that, you know, they're far from first best. So keep that in mind, but they include all kinds of things. You know, they have monthly household surveys. They have quantitative surveys of local governments and community activists. We have key informant surveys, interviews of people across the service spectrum. We talk to principals, we talk to teachers, we talk to households, you know, to really understand why people aren't sending their kids to school. And that quantitative information then feeds back into those quantitative surveys. So it's really a range of systems that you try to develop that are just in time and that are as free from manipulation as possible. So I mean, that's kind of how we think about data systems in that context, which is far from the typical context. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So we're at time, so I would just like to say a huge thank you to all four of our speakers. Really incredibly interesting stuff that you've been presenting, and I think leaving all the participants with lots to think about and lots to follow up on. So a huge thank you to each of you. Participants, please do, if you have a moment, fill out our feedback survey that's in the chat box. Thanks everyone so much for joining.
thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Claire.